I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm only going to take a relatively short call on this matter because I think most of what needs to be said has already been said, and it is in the end a relatively simple issue, even if it does have some quite significant impacts. As others have said, the purpose of the bill is actually to clarify the law in particular circumstances, which is those which relate to locating legal property boundaries of land affected by movement of that land as a result of the 2010 and 2011 earthquake sequences in Canterbury. And in addition to that, another purpose is to provide for guidelines to be issued about standards to assist with boundary determinations so that surveyors can do their jobs properly and people can rely on what they do. Mr Speaker, it has been very difficult for surveyors to actually do that job in the circumstances which Christchurch and other parts of Canterbury are in at the present time. It's very difficult to identify and interpret physical boundaries, especially surveying pegs and the like, in the circumstances which have occurred. And this bill addresses the problem by attempting to provide people, landowners and surveyors alike, with some certainty about legal boundaries of land in Greater Christchurch which have moved because of the earthquake sequences. And it does that actually by providing some flexibility. So what we're going to get is certainty from some flexibility around the general rules which usually apply to the location and identification of boundaries. And that is very necessary in the circumstances which have occurred. So even though I am a lawyer who tends to want to stick by the rules, let me be the first to say this, that in the circumstances which have occurred in Christchurch, there is a need to vary the usual legal rules relating to boundaries somewhat, simply to provide for the practicalities of what has happened and to provide certainty for people whose boundaries have moved with the land. And that is actually what this bill does. It's as simple as that. It's not incredibly difficult to understand, and I'm at a little bit of a loss when I heard some of the Labor speakers who tended to overcomplicate what is actually a relatively simple issue. Now, I'm not saying that there won't be anomalies which will occur, but those anomalies will happen whether we pass this legislation or not. And the reason for that is that there is a whole array of different things which have happened in Christchurch and Canterbury which will affect property boundaries and their identification. So I actually agree that there does need to be some flexibility. It's not going to alter the long-term general rules about the location and identification of property boundaries, so there's nothing to panic about. This is simply a bill to assist in practice with some sensible new legislation to assist people with their boundary identifications in the particular circumstances of Christchurch and Canterbury. And I welcome that kind of legislation because I approve of good, practical, sensible legislation, and that's what New Zealand First stands for. It's not usually what the national government stands for, but in this case they, by possibly sheer coincidence, have got it right on this occasion. So I'm going to support them, and New Zealand First is going to support them with this particular piece of legislation for that reason. I do think that people need to look to Parliament when there are circumstances out of the ordinary, with the expectation that we won't simply say, well, sorry, that's the law, that's the way things are, go away, deal with it. I do think you need to have a practical approach. And I want to say this, Mr Speaker, I spent a long time when I was in legal practice doing work on the West Coast. And if there was one part of this country where you need a practical and sensible approach to the law, and especially to property issues, it is on the West Coast. Because there are things that happen there which are actually very, well, I can see Mr Hague nodding, he understands what I mean. And what I'm saying is you do need in those sorts of places, those parts of the country, to take a practical approach, and I appeared before many judges who actually took that approach because they knew that in places like the West Coast and possibly other places in this country, the Chatham Islands, yes, Ms Dyson, is another place. Those judges know that the strict application of the law actually causes so much injustice that they have to take a more sensible approach. This is that kind of legislation, and I commend it to the House simply because a parliament needs to be responsive to a population which is under stress and needs a good practical solution to what has happened. So this is a good piece of legislation. We should all vote for it and just get on with it.